Okay, good evening, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. I want to give a special shout out to the class of 2014. Welcome back. I believe this counts as continuing education. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Francesca Hughes, who is this semester's Vincent Scully Visiting Professor of Architectural History. The Scully Visiting Professorship was endowed by an anonymous donor. Previous Scully professors include Joan Achman, Mary McLeod, Esther de Costa-Meyer, Stanislas von Moos, and Dietrich Neumann, among others. The inaugural Scully professor appointed in 2005 was Kurt Forster. And it is a real pleasure for us to add Francesca Hughes to this distinguished list of scholars and historians. Professor Hughes is also this year's George Morris Woodruff Class of 1857 Memorial Lecturer in Architecture, which is what tonight's event is, the George Morris Woodruff Memorial Lecture. The Woodruff series was established in 2010 by his great-grandson, the late H. Allen Brooks, Yale class of 1955. Brooks was also an eminent historian. He specialized in the work of Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, and for most of his long career taught at the University of Toronto. For most previous Woodward lecturers include Eve Blau, Kurt Foster, Barry Bergdahl, Anthony Vidler, Joan Achman, Sarah Lewis, Lizbeth Cohn, and Kathleen James Chakrabarty. Nice to add you to that list as well. Professor Hughes received her PhD from the University of Edinburgh, where she also received her Bachelor of Science. In addition, she has a Master of Architecture from the University of East London. Having taught both studio and history and theory in London at the Bartlett School, which is part of University College London, and then at the Architectural Association, I think for a total of more than 25 years. She was also the Professor of Architecture and the head of school in Australia at the University of Technology, Sydney, from 2018 to 2020. Welcome back to the other hemisphere. Her books include The Architect, Reconstructing Her Practice, MIT Press, 1996, which focused on feminist critical theory and architectural practice. She also works on the history of technology, and to this end, her research spans a critique of architecture's use of computation. Her work also includes an ongoing examination of architecture's relation to precision and material error, probably best covered in her book, The Architecture of Error, Matter, Measure, and the Misadventures of Precision, which was MIT Press in 2014. More generally, her writings and collaborative design work have been published in the AA Files, the British magazines Architectural Design and Architectural Review, Art Forum, Columbia University's Books on Architecture, eFlux Architecture, and the Harvard Design Magazine, among many, many others. Every architectural journal, book, publisher, et cetera, you could name, you could just rattle off, all have published Francesca's work. So please join me in welcoming her for her lecture tonight, which is called Circling the Digital, A Troubled History.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah, for a very lovely and welcoming introduction. And I've had a very lovely and welcoming first couple of weeks here. I'm incredibly excited to be here. It's a real honor, trying not to be weighed down by this honor, to be stepping into this role. But more than that, it's a kind of very great pleasure to be in the school, to have the kind of opportunity to work with the faculty here and also to work with the students here. I've had some completely brilliant conversations thus far, and it's just kind of week 3 or whatever it is. So I'm happy. I've been working on an histoire longue-durée of the co-constitution, and by corollary that also means the co-production of the long project of computation and architecture, which is to say that if we're to reimagine architecture now, as we must, we obviously need to for both existential and moral reasons, we also need to reimagine its relations to computation. And this is what I've been trying to think about. And in order to do that, it would seem that we need to look back, that we need to think about how they have come to be developed in the way that they have, quite what the complexity of their long entanglement has been. As architecture slips wittingly and unwittingly into the embrace of AI, we might remind ourselves that well before the arrival of the modern computer, the ideations of architecture and computation, the decorporalization of thought, let's say, were already long entangled, if not co-constitutive. The long history of computation is, as we all know, one of the more complex technological histories. It's full of cul-de-sacs, long doldrums, interspersed with radical transformations, attacks of amnesia, repeated swings between occultism and rationalism, a kind of litany of treatises and tenacious hope. Much, if that sounds familiar to you, it's not surprising, much you might think like the history of architecture. The project of correction has always been part of the project of architecture. Just think of the serial rappel à l'ordre that make up the various treatises through history, and indeed have always been, in a sense, part of the utopic project of architecture. Many of the anxieties and pathologies that we think of as peculiar to architecture, that we think of belonging just to us, are also, it turns out, endemic to the long project of computation. The project of computation is, after all, the Uber project of correction: missionary, theological, litigious, adversarial, arithmetic, eugenic, and more recently, marketplace compliance. So the machines, if we kind of go through these machines here, the machines of Lull, then Lull and Leibniz, then Babbage, and then Galton, and then today's AI-powered digital solutionism, were designed to correct, respectively, sin, flawed arguments, human arithmetical error, dissipation of genius in a population, and cosmetically fix the dysfunctions of late capitalism. And what we find is that each new corrective impulse, architecture, is there. Sketch a long history of the project of computation, and don't worry, I'm not going to do this tonight. This is a background of its constituent duties, devices, and desires, a history of memory storage, retrieval systems, deletion and forgetting protocols, the algorithm and prediction, the pen, the window, code and the compression of a reductive system that harbors synthetic ambitions and guarantees true products. All of this is arguably inseparable from, and even unthinkable from, the history of architecture's own memory and storage systems, own role in forgetting and erasure, own use of the algorithm and prediction, architecture's pen, architecture's window, architecture's code, architecture's compressive and reductive systems that, of course, always guarantee us true products. That is to say, the externalization of memory and forgetting, the decorporalization of the movement that is thought, itself via that of the processing algorithm, the meeting of the physical interface of the screen with the cognitive interface of universal languages and the Enlightenment, say, and the discrete, is inseparable from the history of architecture, of our knowledge systems, our spatial and synthetic logics, and our corrective and compressive apparatuses, and their collective deployment to serve architecture's own sublimated desires and anxiety. So, in short, without architectural imagination, the computer would not be the same, and likely vice versa. That is, when we first poured our architectural tasks into the computer, it was already full of architecture. And we might imagine that computation found architecture to be already full of computation. It follows that the architect's computer, then, is fundamentally different from the scientist's computer, and that it can never be simply a tool for us, because architecture is already deep inside the ideation and the makeup of the project of computation. Likewise, for the universal discrete machine, architecture can never simply be a new data set. There is nothing universal about this machine in the eyes of architecture. Our relations to it are always already profoundly and complexly indiscrete. They're almost incestuous. So given this, why did architecture welcome computation last century as if it didn't already know it? and know it intimately, as if it was somehow some kind of exotic stranger to get excited about and suddenly do new things with, and not a project that had frequently visited architecture and with which architecture already shared an entangled past. And why, despite this complex entanglement, do both share the peculiar insistence on a state of autonomy that never quite stacks up? And the problem is, this two-way painting of false autonomy shuts off now the myriad possibilities for architecture and computation and their mutual futures, as it facilitates the kind of construed inevitability that there's no other way for us to imagine architecture's engagement with computation. As we submit to the traps of what Keller Easterling would call the Turing-complete world solutionism, and not to mention the planet-burning data hoarding, Marina Otero's work, and the practices of platform capitalism in which Revit becomes yet another marketplace that pays rent to emergent techno-feudalism. So surely we need to reimagine both the architect's computer and the computer's architect in their mutual immutable pasts and futures. But this lecture is an aside to all of that, because Deborah asked me to talk about recent research, and this is long in coming, it's a long history, and it's taking a long time. And something erupted recently, which qualifies as recent research, when a very brilliant and dear colleague of mine, and who's been following this work, I've been talking to him about this work, and I forget what we were talking about, but he suddenly said, oh yeah, you know, that's, I can see how that resonates with your work on geometry. To which I thought, what work on geometry? You know, what was he talking about? He never listens, and I'm not interested in geometry, I'm not working on geometry. In fact, I couldn't care less about geometry, I pretty much hate geometry. And evidently, as some of them like to reappear, I had been accumulating circles, and clearly he had spotted this, and I had not. And not because I like circles, as I've just explained, but clearly because the history of computation is, a bit like the history of architecture, plagued with circles. Circles haunt it. And what's interesting is that each of these circles are sites of trouble for the history of computation, and in particular for its co-productive relations with architecture. Part of what, as architects, we know part of what these circles are telling us, part of what circles are always telling us, is that they have utopic ambitions. For both architecture and computation, the circle remains the geometric vehicle of choice for any world-building endeavor. But computation's relations to the circle are complicated. I think they're much more complicated than architecture's relations to the circle, but maybe I'm wrong on that. And one can even say the history of computation is complicated by the circle, afflicted by a kind of hauntology of the circle. And suffice to say, the circle has always been a reliable site of trouble, failure, misadventure on the one hand, that then is coupled with a kind of countermeasure and suppression for computational ideation. As architects drilled in the Western canon and ignorant of others, we know that many circles that circulate both histories are always also trying to tell us that the intersection of the co-constitutive histories of computation and architecture, that is, in a sense, if the circle is at that intersection, in that circle is the body. That's what our canon tells us. Though, as we shall see, perhaps the body that troubles this intersection is not so Vitruvian. Two bodies, or more precisely, the body under two regimes, two imperatives, is present here, the late arriving circle. While architecture traditionally sought to embed the body deep within its makeup to contain and appropriate its proportions, its centering or homing coordinates, its autopoietic capacity, its skin, its structure, its plumbing, and we know this long list and the list goes on, the long project of computation, by contrast, is the project to be rid of the body, to completely decouple thought from the body, from flesh and sin, so that it might finally be free of error. That is, the body that architecture classically embeds and extends in Widler's anthropomorphic analogy to lend itself, again, quoting from Widler, proportional and figurative authority, is famously secured via the circle, while the body of sin and error that the project of computation sought to escape in its decorporalization of thought is, as we shall see, paradoxically eclipsed, if not eliminated, by the very same circle. That is, in the co-constitutive history of architecture and computation, we can understand it as organized around their different relations to the body as cathexis of the two, that is simultaneously entrapped and evacuated, entrapped by architecture's circle and evacuated by computation's circle. In my disaggregated and indiscrete historiographic labors that I kind of opened with, that have been going on for a long time and hopefully won't be going on for too much longer around the discrete, I've been recently returning to Vidler's dismembering, to remember as in membre, as in the French for limb, the memory machine. And it's worth noting that whilst the dissected or disarticulated body can be reassembled, the dismembered body cannot. According to forensic anthropologists, dismemberment is present only when two conditions are satisfied. Firstly, to render the parts such that it's no longer possible to put them back together again in the same way. That's the kind of Humpty Dumpty clause. And secondly, to render the original body beyond recognition, and ideally as an added extra, to render the author and the methodology also beyond identification. So dismemberment is a double obscuration of both subject and object. Dismembering thus complicates beyond retrieval subject-object relations and reimagines architecture's relations to computation through subject-object relations, and instead requires us, for instance, to reimagine architecture's relations to computation through re-understanding their historic entanglement. Returning to our big pile of digital circles, though, if the body was the problem for the computer, it was the problem the computer was trying to solve, the serial recourse to the circle would bring no relief, as the body was also a problem for the circle. And we shall see that in following 5 circles, and I'm going to go at pace through 5 circles. So let's start with circle number 1, Filaret, and Filaret's circle trouble. In its newly found corpulescence, the robotic nozzle from which architecture now oozes must seriously reference back to the home. If any of you have done digital printing, you'll know about this, or the 0, coordinates, so that the nozzle knows where it is in space. Like the Vitruvian body, this printed body too must be centered. The homing of the machine or robot at whose tool center point, via addition or subtraction, the building now arrives, owes everything to Vitruvius's navel as the origin point in space and time from which architecture begins its making, and for all subsequent coordinates in drawing and then in the materialization of building. Consider the navel, let's kind of flip this, as the home position to which architectural bodies themselves must serially rehome, again so that neither line nor labor nor material gets lost along their toolpath. Just as homing or referencing allows the machine to internally figure out where the nozzle head is located in machine space, the projected and projecting navel in the basilica section, church's plan, and the city's organization allowed roof tile, altar slab, and law court, respectively, to figure out where they were within a global but ultimately hermetic geometric logic whose 0 anchored all. Not only does the latter-day Vitruvian navel determine all, it comes first. The first thing a CNC router must do before it goes off and does some routing is home itself so it knows it doesn't err along the way. Like all world-making, the machine is drawing the world from its own point of view. But the Vitruvian all-anchoring navel was not without some kind of dissimulated ambiguity, something we frequently choose to forget. The location of the point that pinned down Western architecture's home coordinates and the generative geometric origin of all virtual and material line-making is, as translator of Filaret John Spencer describes, strict, but rather vague. And it's kind of, what on earth does that mean? Strict in that if one follows Vitruvius's instruction to the letter, man fits perfectly in a square and in a circle. Vague in that the center of man in the circle is his navel, while the center of man in the circle is, as Rightwort so kind of politely and Englishly puts it, his generative member. Cesarino's 1521 woodcuts of Vitruvius's bicentered men present both origin points as equally valid, apparently without conflict, suggesting navels and genitals are kind of somehow interchangeable within this schema. And in a sense, perhaps they are. Perhaps this is precisely how architecture's autopoietic home conceals, barely, I'd say, it's not very concealed, the unstable relations to origins coordinates that anchor the sexual metaphoric acrobatics, always at play in its reproductive logics. But even if we just kind of park that inconsistency, if we overlook this inconsistency and stay with the navel as the center of the circle, this too is constitutionally unmoored. In A Quiet Aside, in Filaret's treatise on architecture, he admits to the possible discovering, upon testing with his compass, that the origin or center point is adrift. In asserting all measure is derived from the human body, and duly reciting Vitruvius, he adds, Vitruvius says that the navel is the middle of the figure of man. The navel would be the center of the point of a compass that would circumscribe the man in a circle, and from this the circle derives. It's good enough reason to confirm our proposition that all measures are derived from man. However, it doesn't seem to be exactly in the middle, but the circle does remain round. So in a sense, how can this be? What is a circle that is able to remain round whilst its compass point is not exactly in the middle? If the navel is origin point and the center of the circle at the same navel's bodies described do not align, what then is going on between the body and the circle? Has some kind of arrangement been reached? Similarly, you'll all know this picture. Alberti's De Pictura offers his draftsman largesse a license to fudge in the case of circular surfaces. Recognizing the circle's inherent resistance to his system, even with the mediating use of a velo, he suggests that while you could, of course, always follow his instruction and patiently map an orthogonal projection of the curvature onto a perspectival grid, he adds, however, but as it would be an immense labor to cut the whole circle at many places with an almost infinite number of small parallels until the outline of the circle will there continuously marked with a numerous succession of points, when I've noted 8 or such points, so he only uses 8 points to draw a circle, that's kind of an octopan in my book, he says, I use my judgment to set down the circumference of the circle in the painting in accordance with these indications. So judgment, that's the first fudge, but here comes the second fudge. Perhaps a quicker way would be to draw this outline from a shadow cast by a light. So the light is not casting the shadow. There is a curved body in the room that here, rather than destabilize the circularity of what Mario Carpo has called the first digital circle, in offering a shortcut, actually delivers us from the tyranny of the circle's new production. The object is the way out. The body object is the way out. The analog shortcut, it points to, pulls the rug out of, makes a fool of even, because he only uses 8 points, the copious redundancy of the looping algorithm in the case of circular surfaces. Our third circle, the circle is also there from the get-go as the nascent machine that must mimic the movement of the thinking body in rehousing disembodied thought. Ramon Lal, and any Spanish-speaking people, forgive me, I'm not going to say you because it sounds so ridiculous in an English accent, I'm just going to say Lal. Ramon Lal's 13th century project to cut off the production of truth from the senses, and thus from the corruption of bodies and their creaturely limitations, i.e. sin, saw decorporalization as a necessary first step in thought getting ready to be housed in another kind of body, a sinless body, as yet to be imagined, that is, the machine of thought. Though the algorithm, with its autopoietic fertility, was already there, this new body was not. Lal's Ars Magna sets out the terms for third-degree knowledge, knowledge utterly divorced from the sensorial, as the production of knowledge decorporalized. This is the promise of thought that will think no falsehoods. If first-degree knowledge was understood as sensible knowledge from sensible things, and by sensible I don't mean practical, I mean sensorial, through your senses, then Aristotle's second-degree knowledge, in which sensorial perception provides the input data before abstract reasoning takes over as intellectual knowledge of sensorial things. Then Lull's logica nova, in excluding sensorial perception entirely, produced third-degree knowledge, intellectual-only knowledge of intellectual-only things. So the body is out of the picture. In so doing, Lull completed the disembodying of thought that Aristotle, as conveyed through Averroes, had started. But here lies the crux. Thought decorporalized still needed to move somehow in order to process, in order to exhaust its combinatorial set. That is, thought decorporalized must be lent some other body, but a senseless body this time, otherwise we're back to square one. And the other thing to kind of note here that's interesting is decorporalization of thought can be understood as occurring prior to the arrival of the machine of thought, in which decorporalized thought, still needing to move, is subsequently housed, and then the machine does the moving for it. That is, thought was not decorporalized in order to install itself in the machine. The rehousing of thought in the machine resulted from Lull's decoupling of thought from the body of Aristotle's senses. What's important for us to note here also is that in imagining this senseless processing body, this new machine of thought, Lull's ternary system, because it was ternary, not binary, that was a loss, turns not to the contemporary equivalent of what would become, for instance, Anathasius Kirkus' cubic matrix, which you might think might be a natural home for a ternary system, but to the circle's coup de grace, the wheel. The decisions of Lull's rotating paper wheels, while devoid of corporal input, as their rehousing in a wheel already suggests, still move and, being wheels, chose to rotate. Lull's fuzzy wheels become Leibniz's discrete wheels when he puts cogs on them, and then Babbage's wheels, and then the looping tapes on the face of Katharine Hepburn's Emmerach. In our fourth circle, we find a latter-day echo of Spencer's paradoxical, strict but rather vague formula that describes the meeting of the corporal with the geometric in production in Ivan Sutherland's ever-extraordinary 1963 design of the first drafting software, Sketchpad. Sketchpad allows a drafting hand, as we're about to hear, to be quite sloppy and still get a precision drawing out at the same time.
Well, if you notice, that bright dot will jump onto the line as I get close to it.
Well, the dot in the center of the cross, when you get close to the line, jumps over onto it.
Correct.
Why does it do that?
It's much like a gravity field. At the end point, it is even a higher gravity field to allow us to position the point exactly on the line, or in this case, exactly at the end point. This allows me to move my pen quite coarsely, be sloppy while I'm drawing, and get a precision drawing out at the same time. So now I'm going to draw it.
So his pseudo-gravity is him designing snapping. It's him inventing snapping. And in a sense, it's him designing the discernment of intention in order to correct errors before they could even be made. So this is kind of nascent predictive programming.
Well, if you know...
When Claude Shannon, this is Sutherland's PhD at MIT, when Shannon was supervising it, when Shannon set Sutherland to figure out how we draw a circle in Sketchpad, Sutherland's update to Alberti's circle drawing system, issued some 500 years earlier, completed the decorporalization of circle drawing by erasing the last trace of the fudging body. Whereas Alberti, as we saw, had devised a way to draw radial perfection by erecting an approximating kind of join-the-dots scaffold, Sutherland did away with the stepping stone dots altogether. Alberti's armature gently corrected the erratic radius of our drifting hand. Sketchpad effectively ignored it and used the light pen's location only to decide how much angular length to draw.
I mentioned before we could draw circles also. Right. In order to do this, I must first indicate the center of my circle. Let's choose it to be here. And then I'll move out to an initial radius, let's say this point right here, and I press the second button to start drawing the circle. Here's our circle. Let me reduce the drawing slightly so our circle shows on the computer scope. And you see as I move the pen, it is ignoring the radial position. I've just gone off the scope screen here. The radial position of the pen and only looking at its angular position. So I
It can
can
be very as sloppy as you like, in other words.
right. In other words, the computers supply the compass here, much like as it supplied the straight edge for the straight line,
If you go backwards, you erase it.
and I can wind it up the other way.
So angular length, not radius. If you go backwards, you can erase it. You can be as sloppy as you like. I.e., the body no longer has to be able to draw a circle in order to draw a circle.
I mentioned before we could draw.
Sutherland talks of discovering the power of putting the power of the computer between the hand and the drawing. The once embodied practice of the gesture of the hand synthesizing thought in the making of the drawing is finally and utterly decorporalized. Sutherland's eclipse of the erratic body erases us. That is precisely the geometric formula, the circle that embeds the body in architecture, has successfully evacuated it from the digital. Our last troubled and troubling digital circle concerns the circle that is the search logics, in this case the search for a rather large missing object whose failure disrupted the stability of the logics of the radius and the drawing that is any search process. And this is something I had been working on, Sutherland and Sage, and I started to talk to rather brilliant Adriano Odisho at UTS about how one might think about a drawing losing something. How could you lose something in a drawing? How could be something lost from a drawing? So what follows is research that I worked on with Adriana. And just as we've seen in Sutherland, in designing Sketchpad, not only redesigned the designer, inventing a kind of drafting in which it's virtually impossible to make mistakes, he also invented a drawing in which you cannot lose something. So I'm not going to play another film, Sutherland. You can look it up. So when, on the 8th of March in 2014, a 67-meter-long Boeing 777 aircraft belonging to Malaysian Airlines, flight MH370, disappeared from the drawing on air traffic control screens, that is the drawing of Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, the operatives knew, although they couldn't see it, that it was really still there, but where? The drawing on the air traffic screens has memory. Indeed, it is a drawing that can't forget. But the drawing that has memory is also a panopticon. Nothing can escape its hermetic watch. Despite this, in this case, it loses something. And so in a sense, conceptually, this drawing is first undone by loss. It shouldn't lose things. That's a failure in its constitution. And then paradoxically further undone by its production of the drawing that is the search, that absolutely relies on the circle and the radius, as we'll see, that then also fails. Sutherland had inherited everything from Sage, which is what you see here, the semi-automatic ground environment developed in the same Lincoln labs a decade earlier. There's not time here to go into the extraordinary relationship between software drafting, Sketchpad, and Sage, that is the cursor's debt to the crosshairs, the light pen's debt to the light gun, the raised button's debt to the fire button, the digital architectural drawing's debt to the real-time exigencies of Cold War nuclear permanent threat. Suffice to say, the logic of the bomb is deep within the modern digital drawing. Beyond Sketchpad, another latter-day progeny of Sage is Sabre, the airline booking system, but more relevant here, the design of the real-time drawing that is air traffic control. The Cold War's new state of permanent threat had meant with the end of any downtime, every place had to be defended all of the time. This is this ultimate panopticon state. The task of Sage in the defending of every place all of the time was to draw all of the sky all of the time in real time. In order to construct this four-dimensional panopticon, Whirlwind had turned in 1949 from the task of advancing computation faster than the weather, John von Neumann's dream, and before him Lewis Fry Richardson's dream, one of our other circles, to the task of advancing computation faster than incoming nuclear attack.
This is where America's peace of mind begins. Around the clock, radar's electronic eyes watch the skies and report what they see to SAGE, Defense System of the United States Air Force. Here is a SAGE center on 24-hour alert. At its heart is a computer developed by a research team from MIT and IBM working with the Air Force. The SAGE computer speeds the information for decisions by man in our missile age. Every scheduled flight across American frontiers is recorded ahead of time on IBM punch cards, then fed into the SAGE computer. Now the computer can draw a picture of what is supposed to be in the sky at any moment. It continually compares this expected picture with the real picture as seen by radar. If a flying object does not belong, it appears on this viewing screen. There's one now at the right of the screen. They call it a blip, unknown flying object. Friend or foe? Within seconds, the Air Force will know. The officer fires a light gun at the target blip. This tells the computer to track the object. At the launching site, a long-range Beaumark missile is readied for firing. Now they ask the computer to calculate an intercept point. X marks the spot where the Beaumark missile would meet the moving target if fired immediately. The officer in charge makes the final decision. Fire.
Okay, no more fun. That became the erase button. So in SAGE, the drawing of the sky is no longer depicted by, the conductor on the column waving his baton, as you saw in the 1922 Lewis Fry Richardson, but by a network of many authors. Long-range radars which constantly sweep the skies and our far-flung frontiers, probing high into the atmosphere. Airborne early warning planes in the Air Force patrolling the oceans hundreds of miles offshore, carrying electronic eyes far beyond our borders. Radar picket ships of the Navy, which form a mobile frontier on both oceans, always on watch. So you get the picture. Constantly sweep the skies, electronic eyes, always on watch. Add to this all of these other things. And of course, weather stations. So this networked and real-time drawing then corrects the sky. The Cold War hauntology of the circle, in which we find circles of impact nested in circles of bomb breach, also produced a vast metaphoric dome of paranoia and the hermetic architecture of its control. Fuller's project of Dome over Manhattan was drawn in 1962, only a year after SAGE was finally complete, and the same year as Sutherland was nailing the drawing of the digital circle. How much paranoia, how much of this kind of nuclear reflex was in Sutherland's imaginary whilst he was designing that program? How much of it is still embedded in the algorithms that draw our architectural circles today? Including the city as target, nested in the encircling lifebelt, Norbert Wiener's political theorist Karl Durst and historian of science Giorgio di Santillana's 1950 civil defense plan for American atomic-age cities. The proposed lifebelt radius would just exceed the radius of impact of the expected power of bomb that would be dropped onto the city in question, exceeding the circle of the expected devastation and radiation, as if the city is somehow morbidly designed as a target for whose fleeing citizens the lifebelt provides, quote, and quoting Norbert Wiener, an escape route that could be reached by moving in any direction. Any direction. So the fleeing citizen is somehow recast as a radius. But also the many other circles that participate in the imaginary of the period, including Fuller's geodesic domes that appear on the radomes that manned the distant early warning line, the north line for SAGE, and also the domes on the Texas towers. And two, the circular desk in Kenneth Adams' design for Stanley Kubrick's 1964 Dr. Strangelove, a cunning satire of SAGE. Central to the film and its plot is the all-seeing drawing on the big board. Here you can see the big drawing on the big board, hidden in Adams' cavernous take on the Cheyenne Mountain NORAD bunker. And when the commies are coming, the kind of general stands up and says, we mustn't let them get the big board. They can get everything else, but not the big board. And, of course, that light fitting. That, like the ring around the mushroom cloud, hovers, just stays there and hovers over the protagonists and the entire proceedings of their mountain insanity. Circles, domes, the radius of reach they inscribe were everywhere and everything within this imaginary. As the virtual monument to the Cold War's anxiety anxiety of annihilation in the midst of plenty, while never producing a military effective system, SAGE did produce the first networked and predictive drawing as it harnessed the computer to constantly calculate and recalculate the position, course, and speed, as we have heard, of all aircraft seen by our radar, and continuously present this information on the scopes. So, given this, when MH370 disappeared from the latter-day progeny of our general's big board, all the search operation actually had to work with was radius of reach, fuel time, related to different possible speeds and not velocity because direction wasn't known. As the new task for air traffic control shifted from monitoring scheduled traffic into searching for unscheduled alien trajectories, SAGE's founded purpose returned and performed a further flip in which the search for and the correcting of the future via predictive engineering became a rearview mirror, became forensic. The missing object, had effectively installed amnesia in the drawing that possessed perfect recall. A forensic drawing emerged of a series of radiuses of fuel exhaustion ranges. Radii of mnemonic circles, of the kind of mnemonic architectures that I kind of intimated at the beginning, the past bifurcating architectures of not search, don't sort, but what existed before, sort, don't search, became again this kind of all-arresting logic of the search, in which the last known point, the last known moment when the drawing and the object body aligned became a fertile origin for an infinite set of radii of reach, maximum and minimum fuel exhaustion calibrated to potential wind resistance and altitude effects. There was one other thing that the search had to work with, and that was that architecture of nested circles, that is, the satellite handshakes. Not unlike Sutherland's circle drawing program, the automated interactions known as handshakes between a geostationary Indian Ocean satellite and the aircraft only record linear distance from the satellite to the aircraft. So the aircraft can be anywhere on the circle that generates, and there were 7. Each of the 7 nested circles can be cropped to a set of nested arcs with symmetrical northern and southern scenarios. The final handshake intersected with the 7th circle, establishing 2 arcs of search. And a decision was made to focus, as we know, on the southern arc, but for every question about the southern arc, for every searched area of the southern arc, there was the kind of possibility of what if they were looking at the wrong arc all the time. The initial search area of 600,000 square kilometres at 6 flying hours southwest of Perth was described at the time by the Australian government as close to nowhere as possible. In this nowhere-scape of predictive logics, the multiple attendant scanning technologies whose data set fed the feedback loops, far from reducing the locus, instead constructed proliferating new territories of doubt. As search surfaces, the sea for buoyant debris, the seabed for the rest, further expanded over time. So paradoxically, this process, so subject to geometric logics, had led the search precisely to the landscape that could not be drawn, that evaded the measure that was representation. Plus, as intimated earlier, the territory had 2 grounds: the seabed, as yet unmapped at that time, at a depth of up to 5 kilometres, and the sea surface, subject to extreme winds and complex currents. So in a sense, not only was this drawing on a blank sheet of paper, but this sheet of paper was sliding across the table unpredictably as you were trying to draw on it. Today, you might be simply researching the surface you had already searched yesterday. Despite the clearly military scale of engagement in terms of the vehicles and technologies involved, the increased precision, rather than homing in on a target, paradoxically only proliferated new territories of disappointment. Manifest as a ghostly archipelago of over 40 precisely delineated, often overlapping zones, in the kind of Boostrafeden-like gaze of the equipment, that all they could say was nothing was there but only for that day. After 3 years of meticulously scanning this enormous 850,000 square kilometers of the seafloor and 4.7 million square kilometers of the ocean surface, not one object associated with MH370 was found. In 2015, an extensive list of fragments appeared, far from the search area. A flaperon in Réunion Island in July, a flap track in Mozambique the next year, a horizontal stabilizer in Mozambique again, an engine cowling segment in Mossel Bay in South Africa, identified through the matching the Rolls-Royce stencil, a cabin closet door in Mauritius. In a turn from trust in geometry that had, in a sense, let the search down so much, to that in big data, and from predictive calculation to the counting that is analog simulation, a fleet of replica flaperons were built and dropped into the field test area of Storm Bay, Tasmania, each bay paired with an oceanic buoy to drift modelers. Observing that the flaperons drifted faster than the buoys, and then using the accumulated data of oceanic drift buoys from the previous 20 years, a digital model was constructed to simulate the speed at which a blowing flaperon would traverse the Indian Ocean and reach Ile de la Réunion. If you go backwards, you can undraw. Reverse engineering to the analog. As if to search is to draw, to fail, to find, to lose is somehow to undraw or to undo the drawing itself. Then in a further turn from big data now to the one-to-one, to the object body itself, a natural blowing flaperon 777 is acquired and lowered into the water next to its built replica used for the digital model. They float together for a bit. It's ambiguous where representation, where the drawing is now in this new equation after geometry. Have they, object and simulacra, escaped its logics altogether? The operators note that the real one moves faster than its replica and is observed to veer in its drifting always about 20 degrees to the left, pointing in the direction of Ile de la Réunion from the southern seventh arc. In the same 1992 essay by Vidler, Architecture Dismembered, that I mentioned earlier on, he employs Jean-Paul Sartre's astonishing inversion from being nothingness, and it's an inversion worth going back to now as we embrace AI. Technology, the instrumental complex, does not augment and extend us, Sartre argues, but conversely, it's only via the already existing instrumental complex which surrounds us that we're able to be cognizant of our body. My body is that which, as Sartre states, is on the end of the cane that touches the earth, at the end of the telescope which points at the sky. This inversion, then, destabilizes our prosthetic reflex, our increasingly precarious narratives around the tool. A destabilizing action that also coincides with that of simultaneously embedding and escaping that organizes computation and architecture's mutual cleaving relations to the body, to this, to us. This cleaving site is the site that we must dismember in order to reimagine, that is, to remember its future constitution. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, yes. We have time for a few questions. Up on the mouse.
Hi, so I was wondering, because you're talking about the goal of computation in the long run is to remove error from the body, right? Can you hear me?
Can you? No, if you can repeat that sentence, that'd be good.
Yeah. Okay, great.
That's better.
You're talking about how the goal of computation in the long run is to remove error from the body, right? Is to remove sin, to remove error. But I was wondering, since technology is made by man, is made by the hand of man, isn't error inherent to technology already? And how does that inherent error factor into your research?
Oof. So, great question. What I was trying to say is that Lull's project and Leibniz's project, Leibniz, this is quite loud, isn't it? Thank you. Leibniz basically, with the drawing of the cogs that you saw were for a machine that was to solve all arguments, that there would be no more arguments because we could calculate the answer to all conflicts. Yeah, if only we could do with it today, yeah? So Lull's project, Leibniz's project, the project of the universal languages and the Enlightenment and so on, was to remove the conflict of flesh, but also for Lull's project was a missionary project, was also in a sense, flesh is associated with sin, was to have a machine that would convince the Moor or the Jew of Christianity, literally, would in a sense to harness the objectivity of logic, the objectivity of the machine to do that. So the idea of disembodying thought is at base about removing thought from the flesh is sin, and the error of the body. But of course, as you kind of quite rightly pointed out, yes, but the kind of technology that we have housed thought in is made by us. And as we saw with the search, the more precision you pour in, there's a kind of proliferation of kind of more possibility, in fact, for error. There are complex tautologies at play, yes. It's a good question. Thanks. Thank you.
Hello. So fascinating. Thank you very much. I'm completely lost.
We'll get you on a radius.
Yeah, we're right on line. I'm wondering, in the end, so where's the body then? If we're going into, let's say, the conversation about AI and the further proliferation of the ability to calculate in all these different ways, and also if you think about it in terms of architecture and the way it might come to dominate our, let's say, the connection between thinking about the design and maybe executing it and everything. How do we draw that relationship now?
I don't know. But what I do know is that in order to answer that question, we have to look at the history of architecture's relations to computation. So in a sense, that's what I'm trying to do. And I, in the past, have talked about it as talking indiscreetly about the discrete. And the relations between architecture and computation are very indiscreet, with all the double entendre that you can set up there. I think the Sartre quote, I went back to that Sartre quote in the Vidler just a couple of weeks ago, and I found it shocking, I'm getting feedback, because it's so long since we have thought about, we so much think about machine or technology extending us. It's so long that we have we've done a Rachel White read. We've thought about it the other way. We've cast the negative space, and we've actually thought about the machines that augment us, making our bodies cognizant to us, making it possible for us to comprehend our bodies. And another way to put this is Bratton really argues for non-alignment with AI, and I completely agree. And we need AI not to think like we think. We need AI to do what it can do and what we can't do, so that we can more clearly understand what we can do. And within that arrangement, I find the argument that it's just a tool just doesn't begin to stand up, and a tool that changes you is not a tool. Or if it is just a tool, then we've redefined the tool radically. That doesn't answer your question because I don't know the answer to your question, but I do think for me it's been useful not to think the computer arrived right after the war and then got a bit better during the Cold War. For me, it's been useful to think the computer is there in Cicero's memory architecture. The computer is there in the universal languages of love. It's actually to kind of dismember the architect's computer. Our computer. It's very different from all the scientist's computer or the writer's computer. To really dismember it in order to kind of put it back together, or not put it back together because we're not meant to be able to do that, but to kind of reimagine it and reimagine how we work with it. Sorry, I'm not answering your question.
Thanks for a great talk. I have, I guess, two questions. The first one being, or coming back to Whistler's Architectural Uncanny, the introduction for that book sort of sets up a few definitions, and one of them is the definition of the sublime. Mm-hmm. And I almost wonder if in this stage of technology where it fails us maybe because of our cartographic practices or in the context of machine learning where we don't truly even understand or control the images we produce, if we have a new frontier for the sublime in a way that is man-made. And the other question is, it was interesting to see you sort of phrase this conversation with Yanis Varoufakis' techno-feudalism, and coming back to where the body stands when we think of a feudal system that exists on servers, and what that means for architecture. Does that make war sort of irrelevant when we think of, not irrelevant, but changing when we think of a few companies that hold this sort of feudal power as opposed to governments?
Those are two really brilliant questions that require much longer time to answer, much thought, more intelligence than we all have than I have available here right now. But let's just kind of, in a sense, just to touch on them. Let's do it backwards, yeah. So the obvious, yes, absolutely. The labouring Amazon, what is it called? Satisfaction is some gruesome word they use. That's the labouring Amazon body, literally with a kind of almost umbilical connection to the algorithm, is absolutely, beyond who builds your architecture is who delivers the thing that you press the button for. It's absolutely part and parcel of the feudal ecology that Varoufakis is kind of very cleverly, identified, very cleverly named, and we all participate in it. It's weird how Mid-Journey looks sublime-y. I mean, one was what Kant would make of, or Friedrich would make of all this kind of mistiness and fogginess and drippiness. It's always kind of a bit, but I find it alarming. I found it alarming in, let's say, the early 2000s. The computer arrives and we use it to produce very shiny renders. Why would you do that? You've got this incredible calculatory power. Why would you just produce very shiny drawings? And I just find it weird now that the way we're engaging with AI is to produce misty, drippy buildings covered in plants, or in a desert. And so there's a kind of, I think the aesthetic is like a distraction, isn't it? It's like the Turkish delight in Narnia. It's like, perhaps you shouldn't eat it. So, but what is fascinating about AI is prompt engineering. And so if the whole, again, Leibniz was busy trying to make words behave more like numbers. He's like, if only if we can get words to behave like numbers, people will stop arguing. Now, with AI, we're busy trying to make those same words fuzzy because we're dealing with probabilistic. We'll never get the same answer twice from the same words. So there's, like I say, maybe the answers are in the history. Great question.